The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Volume 1, Chapter 1. Home is the resort of love, of joy, of peace and plenty, where, supporting and supported, polished friends and dear relations mingle into bliss. Thomson. On the pleasant banks of the Garonne, in the province of Gascony, stood, in the year 1584, the chateau of Monsieur St. Aubert. From its windows were seen the pastoral landscapes of Guyenne and Gascony stretching along the river, gay with luxuriant woods and vines and plantations of olives. To the south, the view was bounded by the majestic Pyrenees, whose summits, veiled in clouds, or exhibiting awful forms, seen and lost again as the partial vapors rolled along, were sometimes barren and gleamed through the blue tinge of air, and sometimes frowned with forests of gloomy pine that swept downward to their base. These tremendous precipices were contrasted by the soft green of the pastures and woods that hung upon their skirts, among whose flocks and herds and simple cottages the eye, after having scaled the cliffs above, delighted to repose. To the north and to the east, the plains of Guyenne and Languedoc were lost in the mist of distance. On the west, Gascony was bounded by the waters of Biscay. Monsieur St. Aubert loved to wander, with his wife and daughter, on the margin of the Garonne, and to listen to the music that floated on its waves. He had known life in other forms than those of pastoral simplicity, having mingled in the gay and in the busy scenes of the world. But the flattering portrait of mankind, which his heart had delineated in early youth, his experience had too sorrowfully corrected, yet amidst the changing visions of life, his principles remained unshaken, his benevolence unchilled, and he retired from the multitude more in pity than in anger, to scenes of simple nature, to the pure delights of literature, and to the exercise of domestic virtues. He was a descendant from the younger branch of an illustrious family, and it was designed that the deficiency of his patrimonial wealth should be supplied either by a splendid alliance in marriage, or by success in the intrigues of public affairs. But St. Aubert had too nice a sense of honor to fulfill the latter hope, and too small a portion of ambition to sacrifice what he called happiness to the attainment of wealth. After the death of his father, he married a very amiable woman, his equal in birth, and not his superior in fortune. The late Monsieur St. Aubert's liberality, or extravagance, had so much involved his affairs that his son found it necessary to dispose of a part of the family's domain, and some years after his marriage he sold it to Monsieur Quesnel, the brother of his wife, and retired to a small estate in Gascony, where conjugal felicity and paternal duties divided his attention with the treasures of knowledge and the illuminations of genius. To this spot he had been attached from his infancy. He had often made excursions to it when a boy, and the impressions of delight given to his mind by the homely kindness of the grey-headed peasant to whom it was entrusted, and whose fruit and cream never failed, had not been obliterated by succeeding circumstances. The green pastures along which he had so often bounded in the exultation of health and youthful freedom, the woods under whose refreshing shade he had first indulged that pensive melancholy which afterwards made a strong feature of his character, the wild walks of the mountains, the river on whose waves he had floated, and the distant plains, which seemed boundless as his early hopes, were never after remembered by St. Aubert but with enthusiasm and regret. At length he disengaged himself from the world, and retired hither to realize the wishes of many years. The building, as it then stood, was merely a summer cottage, rendered interesting to a stranger by its neat simplicity or the beauty of the surrounding scene, and considerable additions were necessary to make it a comfortable family residence. St. Aubert felt a kind of affection for every part of the fabric, which he remembered in his youth, and would not suffer a stone of it to be removed, so that the new building, adapted to the style of the old one, formed with it only a simple and elegant residence. The taste of Madame St. Aubert was conspicuous in its internal finishing, where the same chaste simplicity was observable in the furniture and in the few ornaments of the apartments that characterized the manners of its inhabitants. The library occupied the west side of the chateau and was enriched by a collection of the best books in the ancient and modern languages. This room opened upon a grove, which stood on the brow of a gentle declivity that fell towards the river, and the tall trees gave it a melancholy and pleasing shade, while from the windows the eye caught beneath the spreading branches the gay and luxuriant landscape stretching to the west, and overlooked on the left by the bold precipices of the Pyrenees. Adjoining the library was a greenhouse, stored with scarce and beautiful plants. For one of the amusements of St. Aubert was the study of botany, and among the neighboring mountains, which afforded a luxurious feast to the mind of the naturalist, he often passed the day in the pursuit of his favorite science. He was sometimes accompanied in these little excursions by Madame St. Aubert, and frequently by his daughter, when, with a small osier basket to receive plants, and another filled with cold refreshments, such as the cabin of the shepherd did not afford, they wandered away among the most romantic and magnificent scenes, nor suffered the charms of nature's lowly children to abstract them from the observance of her stupendous works. When weary of sauntering among cliffs that seemed scarcely accessible but to the steps of the enthusiast, and where no track appeared on the vegetation but what the foot of the izzard had left, they would seek one of those green recesses which so beautifully adorn the bosom of these mountains, where, under the shade of the lofty larch or cedar, they enjoyed their simple repast, made sweeter by the waters of the cool stream that crept along the turf, and by the breath of wild flowers and aromatic plants that fringed the rocks and inlaid the grass. Adjoining the eastern side of the greenhouse, looking towards the plains of Languedoc, was a room which Emily called hers, and which contained her books, her drawings, her musical instruments, with some favorite birds and plants. Here she usually exercised herself in elegant arts, cultivated only because they were congenial to her taste, and in which native genius, assisted by the instructions of Monsieur and Madame St. Aubert, made her an early proficient. The windows of this room were particularly pleasant. They descended to the floor, and opening upon the little lawn that surrounded the house, the eye was led between groves of almond palm trees, flowering ash and myrtle, to the distant landscape where the Garonne wandered. The peasants of this gay climate were often seen on an evening, when the day's labor was done, dancing in groups on the margin of the river. Their sprightly melodies, debonair steps, the fanciful figure of their dances, with the tasteful and capricious manner in which the girls adjusted their simple dress, gave a character to the scene entirely French. The front of the chateau, which, having a southern aspect, opened upon the grandeur of the mountains, was occupied on the ground floor by a rustic hall and two excellent sitting rooms. The first floor, for the cottage had no second story, was laid out in bedchambers, except one apartment that opened to a balcony, and which was generally used for a breakfast-room. In the surrounding ground, St. Aubert had made very tasteful improvements, yet such was his attachment to objects he had remembered from his boyish days, that he had in some instances sacrificed taste to sentiment. There were two old larches that shaded the building and interrupted the prospect. St. Aubert had sometimes declared that he believed he should have been weak enough to have wept at their fall. In addition to these larches, he planted a little grove of beech, pine, and mountain ash. On a lofty terrace, formed by the swelling bank of the river, rose a plantation of orange, lemon, and palm trees, whose fruit, in the coolness of evening, breathed delicious fragrance. With these were mingled a few trees of other species. Here, under the ample shade of a plane tree that spread its majestic canopy towards the river, St. Aubert loved to sit in the fine evenings of summer with his wife and children, watching beneath its foliage the setting sun, the mild splendor of its light fading from the distant landscape, till the shadows of twilight melted its various features into one tint of sober gray. Here, too, he loved to read and to converse with Madame Saint-Aubert, or to play with his children, resigning himself to the influence of those sweet affections which are ever attendant on simplicity and nature. He has often said, while tears of pleasure trembled in his eyes, that these were moments infinitely more delightful than any passed amid the brilliant and tumultuous scenes that are courted by the world. His heart was occupied. It had, what can be so rarely said, no wish for a happiness beyond what it experienced. The consciousness of acting right diffused a serenity over his manners which nothing else could impart to a man of moral perceptions like his, and which refined his sense of every surrounding blessing. The deepest shade of twilight did not send him from his favorite plane tree. He loved the soothing hour when the last tints of light die away, when the stars, one by one, tremble through ether and are reflected on the dark mirror of the waters, that hour which, of all others, inspires the mind with pensive tenderness, and often elevates it to sublime contemplation. When the moon shed her soft rays among the foliage, he still lingered, and his pastoral supper of cream and fruits was often spread beneath it. Then, on the stillness of night, came the song of the nightingale, breathing sweetness and awakening melancholy. The first interruptions to the happiness he had known since his retirement were occasioned by the death of his 2 sons. He lost them at that age when infantine simplicity is so fascinating, and though, in consideration of Madame Saint-Aubert's distress, he restrained the expression of his own, and endeavored to bear it, as he meant, with philosophy, he had, in truth, no philosophy that could render him calm to such losses. One daughter was now his only surviving child, and while he watched the unfolding of her infant character with anxious fondness, he endeavored with unremitting effort to counteract those traits in her disposition which might hereafter lead her from happiness. She had discovered in her early years uncommon delicacy of mind, warm affections, and ready benevolence, but with these was observable a degree of susceptibility too exquisite to admit of lasting peace. As she advanced in youth, this sensibility gave a pensive tone to her spirits, and a softness to her manner, which added grace to beauty, and rendered her a very interesting object to persons of a congenial disposition. But Saint-Aubert had too much good sense to prefer a charm to a virtue, and had penetration enough to see that this charm was too dangerous to its possessor to be allowed the character of a blessing. He endeavored, therefore, to strengthen her mind, to inure her to habits of self-command, to teach her to reject the first impulse of her feelings, and to look with cool examination upon the disappointments he sometimes threw in her way. While he instructed her to resist first impressions, and to acquire that steady dignity of mind that can alone counterbalance the passions, and bear us, as far as is compatible with our nature, above the reach of circumstances, he taught himself a lesson of fortitude, for he was often obliged to witness, with seeming indifference, the tears and struggles which his caution occasioned her. In person, Emily resembled her mother, having the same elegant symmetry of form, the same delicacy of features, and the same blue eyes, full of tender sweetness. But, lovely as was her person, it was the varied expression of her countenance, as conversation awakened the nicer emotions of her mind, that threw such captivating grace around her. Those tender tints that shun the careless eye, and, in the world's contagious circle, die. Saint-Aubert cultivated her understanding with the most scrupulous care. He gave her a general view of the sciences, and an exact acquaintance with every part of elegant literature. He taught her Latin and English, chiefly that she might understand the sublimity of their best poets. She discovered in her early years a taste for works of genius, and it was Saint-Aubert's principle, as well as his inclination, to promote every innocent means of happiness. A well-informed mind, he would say, is the best security against the contagion of folly and of vice. The vacant mind is ever on the watch for relief, and ready to plunge into error to escape from the languor of idleness. store it with ideas, teach it the pleasure of thinking, and the temptations of the world without will be counteracted by the gratifications derived from the world within. Thought and cultivation are necessary equally to the happiness of a country and a city life. In the first, they prevent the uneasy sensations of indolence, and afford a sublime pleasure in the taste they create for the beautiful and the grand. In the latter, they make dissipation less an object of necessity and consequently of interest. It was one of Emily's earliest pleasures to ramble among the scenes of nature, nor was it in the soft and glowing landscape that she most delighted. She loved more the wild wood-walks that skirted the mountain, and still more the mountain's stupendous recesses, where the silence and grandeur of solitude impressed a sacred awe upon her heart, and lifted her thoughts to the God of heaven and earth. In scenes like these she would often linger alone, wrapped in a melancholy charm, till the last gleam of day faded from the west, till the lonely sound of a sheep bell or the distant bark of a watchdog were all that broke on the stillness of the evening. Then the gloom of the woods, the trembling of their leaves at intervals in the breeze, the bat flitting on the twilight, the cottage lights now seen and now lost, were circumstances that awakened her mind into effort and led to enthusiasm and poetry. Her favorite walk was to a little fishing house belonging to St. Aubert in a woody glen on the margin of a rivulet that descended from the Pyrenees, and, after foaming among their rocks, wound its silent way beneath the shades it reflected. Above the woods that screened this glen rose the lofty summits of the Pyrenees, which often burst boldly on the eye through the glades below. Sometimes the shattered face of a rock only was seen, crowned with wild shrubs, or a shepherd's cabin seated on a cliff, overshadowed by dark cypress or waving ash. Emerging from the deep recesses of the woods, the glade opened to the distant landscape, where the rich pastures and vine-covered slopes of Gascony gradually declined to the plains, and there, on the winding shores of the Garonne, groves and hamlets and villas, their outlines, softened by distance, melted from the eye into one rich, harmonious tint. This, too, was the favorite retreat of St. Aubert, to which he frequently withdrew from the fervor of noon, with his wife, his daughter, and his books, or came at the sweet evening hour to welcome the silent dusk, or to listen to the music of the nightingale. Sometimes, too, he brought music of his own, and awakened every fairy echo with the tender accents of his oboe. And often have the tones of Emily's voice drawn sweetness from the waves over which they trembled. It was in one of her excursions to this spot that she observed the following lines written with the pencil on a part of the wainscot. Go, pencil, faithful to thy master's sighs. Go, tell the goddess of the fairy scene, when next her light steps wind these wood-walks green, whence all his tears, his tender sorrows rise. Ah, paint her form, O soul-illumined eyes, the sweet expression of her pensive face, the lightning smile, the animated grace, the portrait well the lover's voice supplies. Speaks all his heart must feel, his tongue would say, yet not all his heart must sadly feel. How oft the flowerest silken leaves conceal the drug that steals the vital spark away. And who that gazes on that angel smile would fear its charm, or think it could beguile? These lines were not inscribed to any person. Emily, therefore, could not apply them to herself, though she was undoubtedly the nymph of these shades. Having glanced round the little circle of her acquaintance without being detained by a suspicion as to whom they could be addressed, she was compelled to rest in uncertainty, an uncertainty which would have been more painful to an idle mind than it was to hers. She had no leisure to suffer this circumstance, trifling at first, to swell into importance by frequent remembrance. The little vanity it had excited, for the incertitude which forbade her to presume upon having inspired the sonnet, forbade her also to disbelieve it, passed away, and the incident was dismissed from her thoughts amid her books, her studies, and the exercise of social charities. Soon after this period, her anxiety was awakened by the indisposition of her father, who was attacked with a fever, which, though not thought to be of a dangerous kind, gave a severe shock to his constitution. Madame St. Aubert and Emily attended him with unremitting care, but his recovery was very slow, and as he advanced towards health, Madame seemed to decline. The first scene he visited, after he was well enough to take the air, was his favourite fishing-house. A basket of provisions was sent thither, with books and Emily's lute. For fishing tackle he had no use, for he never could find amusement in torturing or destroying. After employing himself for about an hour in botanizing, dinner was served. It was a repast to which gratitude for being again permitted to visit this spot gave sweetness, and family happiness once more smiled beneath these shades. Monsieur St. Aubert conversed with unusual cheerfulness. Every object delighted his senses. The refreshing pleasure from the first view of nature, after the pain of illness, and the confinement of a sick chamber, is above the conceptions, as well as the descriptions, of those in health. The green woods and pastures, the flowery turf, the blue concave of the heavens, the balmy air, the murmur of the limpid stream, and even the hum of every little insect of the shade, seemed to revivify the soul and make mere existence bliss. Madame St. Aubert, reanimated by the cheerfulness and recovery of her husband, was no longer sensible of the indisposition which had lately oppressed her, and as she sauntered along the wood-walks of this romantic glen, and conversed with him and with her daughter, she often looked at them alternately with a degree of tenderness that filled her eyes with tears. St. Aubert observed this more than once, and gently reproved her for the emotion, but she could only smile, clasp his hand and that of Emily, and weep the more. He felt the tender enthusiasm stealing upon himself in a degree that became almost painful. His features assumed a serious air, and he could not forbear secretly sighing, "Perhaps I shall some time look back to these moments as to the summit of my happiness with hopeless regret. But let me not misuse them by useless anticipation. Let me hope I shall not live to mourn the loss of those who are dearer to me than life." To relieve, or perhaps to indulge, the pensive temper of his mind, he bade Emily fetch the lute she knew how to touch with such sweet pathos. As she drew near the fishing-house, she was surprised to hear the tones of the instrument, which were awakened by the hand of taste, and uttered a plaintive air, whose exquisite melody engaged all her attention. She listened in profound silence, afraid to move from the spot, lest the sound of her steps should occasion her to lose a note of the music, or should disturb the musician. Everything without the building was still, and no person appeared. She continued to listen till timidity succeeded to surprise and delight, a timidity increased by a remembrance of the penciled lines she had formerly seen, and she hesitated whether to proceed or to return. While she paused, the music ceased, and after a momentary hesitation she collected courage to advance to the fishing-house, which she entered with faltering steps, and found unoccupied. Her lute lay on the table, everything seemed undisturbed, and she began to believe it was another instrument she had heard, till she remembered that, when she followed Monsieur and Madame St. Aubert from this spot, her lute was left on the window-seat. She felt alarmed, yet knew not wherefore. The melancholy gloom of evening, and the profound stillness of the place, interrupted only by the light trembling of leaves, heightened her fanciful apprehensions, and she was desirous of quitting the building, but perceived herself grow faint, and sat down. As she tried to recover herself, the penciled lines on the wainscot met her eye. She started as if she had seen a stranger, but, endeavouring to conquer the tremor of her spirits, rose and went to the window. To the lines before noticed, she now perceived that others were added, in which her name appeared. though no longer suffered to doubt that they were addressed to herself, she was as ignorant as before by whom they could be written. While she mused, she thought she heard the sound of a step without the building, and, again alarmed, she caught up her lute and hurried away. Monsieur and Madame St. Aubert she found in a little path that wound along the sides of the glen. Having reached a green summit, shadowed by the palm trees, and overlooking the valleys and plains of Gascony, they seated themselves on the turf, and while their eyes wandered over the glorious scene, and they inhaled the sweet breath of flowers and herbs that enriched the grass, Emily played and sung several of their favorite airs with the delicacy of expression in which she so much excelled. Music and conversation detained them in this enchanting spot till the sun's last light slept upon the plains, till the white sails that glided beneath the mountains where the Garonne wandered became dim, and the gloom of evening stole over the landscape. It was a melancholy, but not unpleasing gloom. St. Aubert and his family rose, and left the place with regret. Alas, Madame St. Aubert knew not that she left it for ever. When they reached the fishing-house, she missed her bracelet, and recollected that she had taken it from her arm after dinner, and had left it on the table when she went to walk. After a long search, in which Emily was very active, she was compelled to resign herself to the loss of it. What made this bracelet valuable to her was a miniature of her daughter to which it was attached, esteemed a striking resemblance, and which had been painted only a few months before. When Emily was convinced that the bracelet was really gone, she blushed and became thoughtful. That some stranger had been in the fishing-house during her absence, her lute and the additional lines of a pencil had already informed her. From the purport of these lines, it was now reasonable to believe that the poet, the musician, and the thief were the same person. But though the music she had heard, the written lines she had seen, and the disappearance of the picture formed a combination of circumstances very remarkable, she was irresistibly restrained from mentioning them, secretly determining, however, never again to visit the fishing-house without Monsieur or Madame St. Aubert. They returned pensively to the chateau. Emily musing on the incident which had just occurred, St. Aubert reflecting with placid gratitude on the blessings he possessed, and Madame St. Aubert somewhat disturbed and perplexed by the loss of her daughter's picture. As they drew near the house, they observed an unusual bustle about it. The sound of voices was distinctly heard. Servants and horses were seen passing between the trees, and at length the wheels of a carriage rolled along. Having come within view of the front of the chateau, a landau with smoking horses appeared on the little lawn before it. St. Aubert perceived the liveries of his brother-in-law, and in the parlour he found Monsieur and Madame Quesnel already entered. They had left Paris some days before, and were on the way to visit their estate only 10 leagues distant from La Vallée, and which Monsieur Quesnel had purchased several years before of St. Aubert. This gentleman was the only brother of Madame St. Aubert, but the ties of relationship having never been strengthened by congeniality of character, the intercourse between them had not been frequent. Monsieur Quesnel had lived altogether in the world. His aim had been consequence. Splendor was the object of his taste, and his address and knowledge of character had carried him forward to the attainment of almost all that he had courted. By a man of such a disposition, it was not surprising that the virtues of St. Aubert should be overlooked, or that his pure taste, simplicity, and moderated wishes were considered as marks of a weak intellect and of confined views. The marriage of his sister with St. Aubert had been mortifying to his ambition, for he had designed that the matrimonial connection she formed should assist him to attain the consequence which he so much desired, and some offers were made her by persons whose rank and fortune flattered his warmest hope. But his sister, who was then addressed also by St. Aubert, perceived, or thought she perceived, that happiness and splendor were not the same, and she did not hesitate to forego the last for the attainment of the former. Whether Monsieur Quesnel thought them the same or not, he would readily have sacrificed his sister's peace to the gratification of his own ambition, and on her marriage with St. Aubert expressed in private his contempt of her spiritless conduct and of the connection which it permitted. Madame St. Aubert, though she concealed this insult from her husband, felt, perhaps for the first time, resentment lighted in her heart, and though a regard for her own dignity, united with considerations of prudence, restrained her expression of this resentment, there was ever after a mild reserve in her manner towards Monsieur Quesnel, which he both understood and felt. In his own marriage he did not follow his sister's example. His lady was an Italian, and an heiress by birth, and by nature and education was a vain and frivolous woman. They now determined to pass the night with St. Aubert, and as the chateau was not large enough to accommodate their servants, the latter were dismissed to the neighbouring village. When the first compliments were over, and the arrangements for the night made, Monsieur Quesnel began the display of his intelligence and connections, while St. Aubert, who had been long enough in retirement to find these topics recommended by their novelty, listened with a degree of patience and attention which his guest mistook for the humility of wonder. The latter, indeed, described the few festivities which the turbulence of that period permitted to the court of Henry III with a minuteness that somewhat recompensed for his ostentation. But when he came to speak of the character of the Duc de Joyeuse, of a secret treaty which he knew to be negotiating with the Porte, and of the light in which Henry of Navarre was received, Monsieur St. Aubert recollected enough of his former experience to be assured that his guest could be only of an inferior class of politicians, and that from the importance of the subjects upon which he committed himself, he could not be of the rank to which he pretended to belong. The opinions delivered by Monsieur Quesnel were such as St. Aubert forbore to reply to, for he knew that his guest had neither humanity to feel, nor discernment to perceive what is just. Madame Quesnel, meanwhile, was expressing to Madame St. Aubert her astonishment that she could bear to pass her life in this remote corner of the world, as she called it, and describing, from a wish probably of exciting envy, the splendour of the balls, banquets, and processions which had just been given by the court in honour of the nuptials of the Duc de Joyeuse with Margareta of Lorraine, the sister of the Queen. She described with equal minuteness the magnificence she had seen, and that from which she had been excluded, while Emily's vivid fancy, as she listened with the ardent curiosity of youth, heightened the scenes she heard of, and Madame St. Aubert, looking on her family, felt, as a tear stole to her eye, that though splendour may grace happiness, virtue only can bestow it. "It is now 12 years, St. Aubert," replied Monsieur Quesnel, "since I purchased your family estate." "Somewhere thereabouts," replied St. Aubert, suppressing a sigh. "It is near 5 years since I have been there," resumed Quesnel, "for Paris and its neighbourhood is the only place in the world to live in, and I am so immersed in politics, and have so many affairs of moment on my hands, that I find it difficult to steal away even for a month or two." St. Aubert remained silent. Monsieur Quesnel proceeded. "I have sometimes wondered how you, who have lived in the capital and have been accustomed to company, can exist elsewhere, especially in so remote a country as this, where you can neither hear nor see anything, and can, in short, be scarcely conscious of life." "I live for my family and myself," said St. Aubert. "I am now contented to know only happiness. Formerly I knew life." "I mean to expend 30 or 40,000 livres on improvements," said Monsieur Quesnel, without seeming to notice the words of St. Aubert. "For I design next summer to bring here my friends, the Duc de Beaufort and the Marquis Ramont, to pass a month or two with me." To St. Aubert's inquiry as to these intended improvements, he replied that he should take down the old east wing of the chateau and raise upon the site a set of stables. "Then I shall build," said he, "a salle à manger, a saloon, a salle à commune, and a number of rooms for servants, for at present there is not accommodation for a third part of my own people."
It accommodated our father's household, said St. Aubert, grieved that the old mansion was to be thus improved, and that was not a small one.
"Our notions are somewhat enlarged since those days," said Monsieur Quesnel. "What was then thought a decent style of living would not now be endured."
Even the calm St. Aubert blushed at these words, but his anger soon yielded to contempt.
"The ground about the chateau is encumbered with trees. I mean to cut some of them down."
"Cut down the trees, too?" said St. Aubert.
"Certainly. Why should I not? They interrupt my prospects. There is a chestnut which spreads its branches before the whole south side of the chateau, and which is so ancient that they tell me the hollow of its trunk will hold a dozen men. Your enthusiasm will scarcely contend that there can be either use or beauty in such a sapless old tree as this."
"Good God!" exclaimed St. Aubert. "You surely will not destroy that noble chestnut which has flourished for centuries, the glory of the estate. It was in its maturity when the present mansion was built. How often in my youth I have climbed among its broad branches, and sat embowered amidst a world of leaves, while the heavy shower has pattered above, and not a raindrop reached me. How often I have sat with my book in my hand, sometimes reading, and sometimes looking out between the branches upon the wide landscape and the setting sun, till twilight came, and brought the birds home to their little nests among the leaves. How often! But pardon me," added St. Aubert, recollecting that he was speaking to a man who could neither comprehend nor allow for his feelings. "I am talking of times and feelings as old-fashioned as the taste that would spare that venerable tree."
"It will certainly come down," said Monsieur Quesnel. "I believe I shall plant some Lombardy poplars among the clumps of chestnut that I shall leave of the avenue. Madame Quesnel is partial to the poplar, and tells me how much it adorns a villa of her uncle not far from Venice."
"On the banks of the Brenta, indeed," continued St. Aubert, "where its spiry form is intermingled with the pine and the cypress, and where it plays over light and elegant porticos and colonnades, it unquestionably adorns the scene. But among the giants of the forest, and near a heavy Gothic mansion—"
"Well, my good sir," said Monsieur Quesnel, "I will not dispute with you. You must return to Paris before our ideas can at all agree. But apropos of Venice, I have some thought of going thither next summer. Events may call me to take possession of that same villa, too, which they tell me is the most charming that can be imagined. In that case, I shall leave the improvements I mentioned to another year, and I may perhaps be tempted to stay some time in Italy."
Emily was somewhat surprised to hear him talk of being tempted to remain abroad after he had mentioned his presence to be so necessary at Paris, that it was with difficulty he could steal away for a month or two. But St. Aubert understood the self-importance of the man too well to wonder at this trait, and the possibility that these projected improvements might be deferred gave him a hope that they might never take place. Before they separated for the night, Monsieur Quesnel desired to speak with St. Aubert alone, and they retired to another room, where they remained a considerable time. The subject of this conversation was not known, but whatever it might be, St. Aubert, when he returned to the supper-room, seemed much disturbed, and a shade of sorrow sometimes fell upon his features that alarmed Madame St. Aubert. When they were alone, she was tempted to inquire the occasion of it, but the delicacy of mind, which had ever appeared in his conduct, restrained her. She considered that if St. Aubert wished her to be acquainted with the subject of his concern, he would not wait for her inquiries. On the following day, before Monsieur Quesnel departed, he had a second conference with St. Aubert. The guests, after dining at the chateau, set out in the cool of the day for Eperville, whither they gave him and Madame St. Aubert a pressing invitation, prompted rather by the vanity of displaying their splendor than by a wish to make their friends happy. Emily returned with delight to the liberty which their presence had restrained, to her books, her walks, and the rational conversation of Monsieur and Madame St. Aubert, who seemed to rejoice no less that they were delivered from the shackles which arrogance and frivolity had imposed. Madame St. Aubert excused herself from sharing their usual evening walk, complaining that she was not quite well, and St. Aubert and Emily went out together. They chose a walk towards the mountains, intending to visit some old pensioners of St. Aubert, which, from his very moderate income, he contrived to support, though it is probable Monsieur Quesnel, with his very large one, could not have afforded this. After distributing to his pensioners their weekly stipends, listening patiently to the complaints of some, redressing the grievances of others, and softening the discontents of all by the look of sympathy and the smile of benevolence, St. Aubert returned home through the woods, where at fall of eve the fairy people throng, in various games and revelry, to pass the summer night as village stories tell. Thomson. The evening gloom of woods was always delightful to me, said St. Aubert, whose mind now experienced the sweet calm which results from the consciousness of having done a beneficent action, and which disposes it to receive pleasure from every surrounding object. I remember that in my youth this gloom used to call forth to my fancy 1,000 fairy visions and romantic images, and I own I am not yet wholly insensible of that high enthusiasm which wakes the poet's dream. I can linger with solemn steps under the deep shades, send forward a transforming eye into the distant obscurity, and listen with thrilling delight to the mystic murmuring of the woods. "Oh, my dear father," said Emily, while a sudden tear started to her eye, "how exactly you describe what I have felt so often, and which I thought nobody had ever felt but myself. But hark, here comes the sweeping sound over the wood-tops. Now it dies away. How solemn the stillness that succeeds! Now the breeze swells again. It is like the voice of some supernatural being, the voice of the spirit of the woods that watches over them by night. Ah, what light is yonder! But it is gone, and now it gleams again, near the root of that large chestnut. Look, sir." "Are you such an admirer of nature," said St. Aubert, "and so little acquainted with their appearances as not to know that for the glowworm? But come," added he gaily, "step a little further, and we shall see fairies, perhaps. They are often companions. The glowworm lends his light, and they in return charm him with music and the dance. Do you see nothing tripping yonder?" Emily laughed. "Well, my dear sir," said she, "since you allow this alliance, I may venture to own I have anticipated you, and almost dare to venture to repeat some verses I made one evening in these very woods." "Nay," replied St. Aubert, "dismiss the almost, and venture quite. Let us hear what vagaries fancy has been playing in your mind. If she has given you one of her spells, you need not envy those of the fairies." "If it is strong enough to enchant your judgment, sir," said Emily, "while I disclose her images, I need not envy them. The lines go in a sort of tripping measure, which I thought might suit the subject well enough, but I fear they are too irregular." The glowworm. How pleasant is the greenwood's deep-matted shade on a midsummer's eve, when the fresh rain is o'er, when the yellow beams slope and sparkle through the glade, and swiftly in the thin air the light swallows soar. But sweeter, sweeter still, when the sun sinks to rest, and twilight comes on, with the fairies so gay, tripping through the forest walk where flowers unpressed bow not their tall heads beneath their frolic play. To music's softest sounds they dance away the hour, till moonlight steals down among the trembling leaves, and checkers all the ground and guides them to the bower, the long-haunted bower where the nightingale grieves. Then no more they dance, till her sad song is done, but silent as the night to her mourning attend, and often as her dying notes their pity have won, they vow all their sacred haunts from mortals to defend. When down among the mountains sinks the evening star, and the changing moon forsakes this shadowy sphere, how cheerless would they be, though they fairies are, if I with my pale light came not near. Yet cheerless though they'd be, they're ungrateful to my love, for often when the traveller's benighted on his way, and I glimmer in his path and would guide him through the grove, they bind me in their magic spells to lead him far astray. And in the mire to leave him till the stars are all burnt out, while in strange-looking shapes they frisk about the ground, and afar in the woods they raise a dismal shout, till I shrink into my cell again for terror of the sound. But see where all the tiny elves come dancing in a ring, with the merry, merry pipe, and the tabor and the horn, and the timbrel so clear, and the lute with dulcet string, then round about the yoke they go, till peeping of the morn. Down yonder glade two lovers steal, to shun the fairy queen, who frowns upon their plighted vows, and jealous is of me, that yester eve I lighted them along the dewy green, to seek the purple flower, whose juice from all her spells can free. And now, to punish me, she keeps afar her jocund band, with the merry, merry pipe, and the tabor and the lute. If I creep near yonder oak, she will wave her fairy wand, and to me the dance will cease, and the music all be mute. Oh, had I but that purple flower, whose leaves her charms can foil, and knew like fays to draw the juice, and throw it on the wind, I'd be her slave no longer, nor the traveller beguile, and help all faithful lovers, nor fear the fairy kind. But soon the vapour of the woods will wander afar, and the fickle moon will fade, and the stars disappear. Then cheerless will they be, though they fairies are, if I, with my pale light, come not near. Whatever St. Aubert might think of the stanzas, he would not deny his daughter the pleasure of believing that he approved them, and, having given his commendation, he sunk into a reverie, and they walked on in silence. A faint erroneous ray glanced from the imperfect surfaces of things, flung half an image on the straining eye, while waving woods and villages and streams, and rocks and mountain tops that long retain the ascending gleam, are all one swimming scene, uncertain if beheld. Thomson. St. Aubert continued silent till he reached the chateau, where his wife had retired to her chamber. The languor and dejection that had lately oppressed her, and which the exertion called forth by the arrival of her guests had suspended, now returned with increased effect. On the following day, symptoms of fever appeared, and St. Aubert, having sent for medical advice, learned that her disorder was a fever of the same nature as that from which he had lately recovered. She had, indeed, taken the infection during her attendance upon him, and her constitution being too weak to throw out the disease immediately, it had lurked in her veins, and occasioned the heavy languor of which she had complained. St. Aubert, whose anxiety for his wife overcame every other consideration, detained the physician in his house. He remembered the feelings and the reflections that had called a momentary gloom upon his mind on the day when he had last visited the fishing-house in company with Madame St. Aubert, and he now admitted a presentiment that this illness would prove a fatal one. But he effectually concealed this from her and from his daughter, whom he endeavoured to reanimate with hopes that her constant assiduities would not be unavailing. The physician, when asked by St. Aubert for his opinion of the disorder, replied that the event of it depended upon circumstances which he could not ascertain. Madame St. Aubert seemed to have formed a more decided one, but her eyes only gave hints of this. She frequently fixed them upon her anxious friends with an expression of pity and of tenderness, as if she anticipated the sorrow that awaited them, and seemed to say it was for their sakes only, for their sufferings, that she regretted life. On the 7th day the disorder was at its crisis. The physician assumed a graver manner, which she observed, and took occasion, when her family had once quitted the chamber, to tell him that she perceived her death was approaching. "Do not attempt to deceive me," she said. "I feel that I cannot long survive. I am prepared for the event. I have long, I hope, been preparing for it. Since I have not long to live, do not suffer a mistaken compassion to induce you to flatter my family with false hopes. If you do, their affliction will only be the heavier when it arrives. I will endeavor to teach them resignation by my example."
The physician was affected. He promised to obey her, and told St. Aubert, somewhat abruptly, that there was nothing to expect. The latter was not philosopher enough to restrain his feelings when he received this information, but a consideration of the increased affliction which the observance of his grief would occasion his wife enabled him, after some time, to command himself in her presence. Emily was at first overwhelmed with the intelligence, then, deluded by the strength of her wishes, a hope sprung up in her mind that her mother would yet recover, and to this she pertinaciously adhered almost to the last hour. The progress of this disorder was marked on the side of Madame St. Aubert by patient suffering and subjected wishes. The composure with which she awaited her death could be derived only from the retrospect of a life governed, as far as human frailty permits, by a consciousness of being always in the presence of the Deity, and by the hope of a higher world. But her piety could not entirely subdue the grief of parting from those she so dearly loved. During these her last hours she conversed much with St. Aubert and Emily on the prospect of futurity and other religious topics. The resignation she expressed, with the firm hope of meeting in a future world the friends she left in this, and the efforts which sometimes appeared to conceal her sorrow at this temporary separation, frequently affected St. Aubert so much as to oblige him to leave the room. Having indulged his tears awhile, he would dry them, and return to the chamber with a countenance composed by an endeavour which did but increase his grief. Never had Emily felt the importance of the lessons which had taught her to restrain her sensibility so much as in these moments, and never had she practised them with a triumph so complete. But when the last was over, she sunk at once under the pressure of her sorrow, and then perceived that it was hope as well as fortitude which had hitherto supported her. St. Aubert was for a time too devoid of comfort himself to bestow any on his daughter.